بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على نبي الرحمة سيد المرسلين سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين سبحانك لا علم لنا إلا ما علمتنا إنك أنت العليم الحكيم رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقه قولي أما بعد. Yang berhormat Datuk Seri Dr. Zamri bin Abdul Qadir, Minister for Higher Education Malaysia, Tuan Moderator, distinguished panelists, distinguished scholars, students, ladies and gentlemen, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuh. So first of all, allow me to express my deepest thanks and gratitude for the organizers, for the kind invitation to join in these very important conversations which are becoming more critical in the context of latest global developments. And I'm also very grateful that the organizers, USIM, have us Muslim minority communities in mind as an equally important part of this conversation. Although the situations of minorities are unique, but at the same time, they are a highly significant dimension in the collective experience and consciousness of Muslims. In fact, I would go so far as to argue that the experiences of Muslim minorities are a linchpin to dynamic expressions of the Muslim faith. They add to and they underscore the richness and dynamism of Islam, whichever context we live in. And more so now that we are in another period of great turbulence and uncertainty globally. So when we look at geopolitical conflicts, the violence is becoming more extreme. We look at social polarization and xenophobia. Social and religious attitudes are becoming more and more extreme. And when we look at the environment, the weather itself is even becoming more extreme. There is, of course, some overgeneralization here, but the challenges of radicalization and extremism have become much more serious today. And the levels of extremism are quite unprecedented. But what this means is that moderation has become a serious urgency. We may have some discussions and deliberations on the concept, as Prof. Shamsuddin mentioned earlier, about the connotation, the historical connotation to the term moderation. But the value of being in the middle has become a serious urgency, but also in the context of what we're experiencing has become a lot more challenging. And I believe this is why USIM and the organizers have organized this conference. We want to collectively remind ourselves and others out there of the importance of this virtue and principle that should underpin and govern our actions, our policies, and our behaviors. And I agree that the right place for us to start is with our own faith, with Islam, where we could and we should draw from the richness of our intellectual and spiritual traditions to refresh our articulations and expressions of moderation. And if you may allow me just to kind of summarize, what does it mean to be moderate in our world today, in our context? I believe it is to be more compassionate, love and kindness, as Sheikh Nawawi, Yahya Nawawi reminded us, to be more respectful and to be kind to others in what we say and how we say things, and to truly care for others and the environment, which are a very important part of our existence. And most importantly is to be genuine in all that we do in the aspects that I've mentioned. But our commitment is just, in my view, the first step. So this conference is just the first step, because we need to talk about how to embody this virtue. And we should not underestimate the challenge of how to effect this change in our communities and societies. In fact, I'm glad that the conference is actually organized by the Faculty of Leadership and Management, not the Faculty of Theology or Religious Studies, because it is about creating an action plan that can move the needle in our communities and societies towards the ideal of moderation that we often talk about. And by probably my profession, I'm quite an impatient person in terms of not spending too much time talking about the theory and debating about it, but really about seeing change, because change is extremely urgent. We are talking about existential challenges and crises in the world that we live in. And in order to practice moderation, myself, put it into practice, I want to keep my presentation very brief. Let me try this experiment. So what I've done is just to prepare one slide, inshallah everything will be there as a summary, and I hope we can go through this very quickly in respect to the speakers after me and also the discussion, inshallah. I'm sure many speakers in this conference have talked a lot about the concept of moderation, al-wasatiyya, from many of the religious principles, values, and sources. It's a universal, it's a timeless concept, it's Quranic, it's prophetic in both its origins and essence. وَكَذَلِكَ جَعَلْنَاكُمْ أُمَّةً وَسَطًا. And there's so many hadith, بُعِثُّ بِالْحَنِيفِيَّةِ السَّمْحَةِ, tolerance. And we have to draw from all these very important virtues and descriptions of, descriptors of moderation in the way that we can actualize these values in our life. And it's also very interesting, one of the clearest manifestations or applications of moderation in our daily life in the Quran deal with expenditure, the way that we spend what we have. وَالَّذِينَ إِذَا أَنفَقُوا لَمْ يُسْرِفُوا وَلَمْ يَقْتُرُوا وَكَانَ بَيْنَ ذَلِكَ قَوَامًا. And in Surah Al-Isra, وَلَا تَجْعَلْ يَدَكَ مَغْلُولَةً إِلَىٰ عُنُقِكَ وَلَا تَبْسُطْهَا كُلَّ الْبَسْطِ فَتَقْعُدَ مَلُومًا مَحْسُورًا. So when you spend in the middle, not at the extremes, la ifrata wa la tafrit, and this will create that kind of positive change in your life as well. But as I briefly mentioned earlier, there is a broader context in which we are discussing moderation, the turbulent, the troubled world that we live in. So I would urge all of us not to discuss moderation in an abstract manner, so that it does not lose its social and religious meanings and significance, but to root it to our realities. Now, of course, this contextual bit about moderation or all the other values is something which probably there will be a lot of discussions about it. But as Shaykh Yahya mentioned this as well, and I would like to also reiterate that context is important, even part of how we understand and we reinterpret or interpret the rulings or the teachings of the Sharia. Because even in the Sharia and the usul, we talk about the importance of urf or local conditions. Imam al-Qarafi in al-Furuq, he has this very wonderful statement. He says, إِذَا جَاءَكَ رَجُلٌ مِنْ غَيْرِ أَهْلِ إِقْلِيمِكَ يَسْتَفْتِيكَ فَلَا تُجْرِيهِ عَلَى عُرْفِ بَلَدِكَ وَاسْأَلْهُ عَنْ عُرْفِ بَلَدِهِ وَأَجْرِهِ عَلَيْهِ وَأَفْتِهِ دُونَ عُرْفِ بَلَدِكَ وَالْمُقَرَّرِ فِي كُتُبِكَ. So if someone comes to you and asks about, he has a religious question, but he comes from somewhere, not from your locality, not from your town, not from your country or your neighborhood. Now you need to advise him based on his customs, on his urf, not on yours. You do not impose your local conditions on his. So I think this is a very important principle in the way we discuss anything in Islam, from the perspective of Islam, is to consider the unique environment, the unique conditions and challenges that every society or community faces. Today, a lot of scholars speak about the fiqh al-waqi' or the appreciation of context or reality, which I think speak on the same principle. But today we know that increasingly the world gravitates towards extremes and ideological polars in politics, in ethnic and religious attitudes, as I've mentioned. So if you want to be a moderate person, you risk looking like a misfit or an outlier. You're out of trend, right? You either be an extreme on either sides of the ideological spectrum, or you look like a misfit in society. So the voice begins to shrink in terms of importance and significance. We are swimming against a tide that is growing in the world. But one of the key questions to ask is, why is this happening? This is particularly but not exclusively in the West. And in my reading, there are three interlinked factors around this. The first is the intolerance of differences. Because difference becomes a powerful marker of non-belonging. You do not belong because you're different. And difference is seen as a threat, sometimes as an existential threat, and a risk for progress and development of a group, and that group is usually the majority. So this, over time, then leads to an exclusivist outlook, and this is happening a lot. The tide is sweeping in some parts of the world, as we see. The second reason is anxiety and concerns over survival, and these are all interlinked. A lot of people are concerned about livelihoods and standards of living, and we know we are living in a high inflationary environment. Cost of living is high everywhere we look at, so people are unhappy, and they need to find who to blame. And it is a lot easier to point the finger at those who do not look like or speak like us, who do not look like one of us. It's a lot easier to do that, however irrational or unreasonable that kind of behavior is. And the third is the loss of communal values, such as empathy and hospitality. We talked about, Sheikh Nawawi talked about, Yahya talked about ihsan and rifq. empathy and hospitality. But all these are possibly contributed by an unfettered type or brand of capitalism and interlinked with the rise of the individual. And with the rise of the individual, you see the rise of egocentricities. It's all about ourselves, all about that one person, as opposed to a more inclusive and compassionate outlook on growth and progress. Now, this is quite interesting. This is my theory, and I could be wrong. We can have a discussion on this. But as the extremes begin to shift, the middle will shift too, because you do not want to look completely like a misfit. And therefore, this will affect where we locate moderation and what it should look like in practice. And therefore, we should be mindful of this shifting of the middle, and we must try to remind ourselves and bring our communities back to the true middle. We have to continue to be the true north, not the magnetic north that shifts. Now, for each of the three factors that I mentioned, this conference and many of the speakers before me and yesterday would have spoken about Islamic traditions and values which can provide a powerful response. And these values are the core of the concept and principle of moderation. And this is moderation, and this is where our work already begins. So I'm just going to list down three counter-arguments to, or at least three counterpoints to the factors or trends that we are seeing around the world. Against an intolerance for difference, we know that Islam puts forth a vision of inclusivity and acceptance of others for a very simple reason. The Quran, Islam, the Prophet ﷺ recognize that there are humans like us. Even as we have our own theology, our own boundaries, our own salvific worldview, but we are dealing with people. And that was the advice of the Prophet ﷺ to Sayyidatina Aisha radiallahu anha. And this is the concept of humanity, al-insaniyah, al-bashariyah, which is central to our worldview. And Sayyidina Ali karramallahu wajha in an athar said, الناس صنفان إما أخ لك في الدين أو نظير لك في الخلق. There are two types of people, and either way they are connected to us. And this is also in Surah Al-Hujurat, لِتَعَارَفُوا. We know in Islam the teaching for us is from al-i'tiraf, to recognize that others exist, إِلَى التَّعَارُف, to be able to get to know them, إِلَى التَّآلُف, and begin to have some kindness and some compassion and some mercy for them, and to care for their well-being as much as we care for ourselves. I just wanted to also mention in this regard, if I may, the intolerance for difference. Although we know Islam puts forth this vision, Islam teaches us tolerance and acceptance of others, but we ourselves in our own house, we have a problem insofar as dealing with differences within Muslim communities. When we have difference of opinions, we have seen how ikhtilaf, the difference of opinions, have actually led to the breakup of communities, to high levels of hatred and enmity between Muslims, the takfir phenomena and many other things of various degrees of seriousness in our community. So we have to sort our own house first. We have to solve what is in our backyard before we are able to go out to the world and preach moderation in a more effective way. The second point about caring for our own survival, the survivalism in many of the societies that we have seen concerns only for themselves. Now, Islam always has focused on the ummah. It's always the ummah. وَكَذَلِكَ جَعَلْنَاكُمْ ummah. And ummah, apart from the reference to Sayyidina Ibrahim alayhi salam in Ibrahim kana ummatan qanitan lillahi hanifa. But the rest is really about ummah, is about people. The community or the society, not just the individual. And everything that comes in Islam as part of the Sharia is really speaking about caring for other people, caring for the community and society. So we have the maqasid, protecting everyone's basic rights. It applies to everyone in society. It does not discriminate. The maqasid does not discriminate in the protection of the basic rights of everyone. And in fact, the Sharia, and this is, I think, one of the most beautiful characters of a Sharia, is highly attentive and sensitive to the human condition. It's very highly sensitive. If the human condition begins to deteriorate, the Sharia comes in to bring in interventions. And that's why you have the rukhsa, not just the azima. Right? When someone is not well, someone cannot handle the fast in Ramadan. There is a way out. It's sensitive to the pain and suffering that people feel, but not just our own pain and suffering, but pain and suffering of other people too. And this is what Imam al-Ghazali describes as the maqsood al-shara'. Maqsood al-shara', the intent of the Sharia, And this has been explained as the protecting the 5 fundamentals. And we know that a lot of Sharia is also about protecting the public good, the maslahah, the prevention of harm, dar'ul mafsada. All these are central to Islam. In fact, one of these scholars, Sheikh Imam Najmuddin al-Tufi, the 14th century, he has a very long treatise focused on the hadith, la darara wa la dirar, do not harm or repay one harm with another. And he says that the Sharia is all about the avoidance of harm, all about the avoidance of danger and risk of disintegrating societies and causing harm. And isn't it plainly evident to all of us that today in our world, this has to be a global priority. It is now not just about securing maslahah or good. Today, the urgency and the awlawiyah, the priority is about protecting us from falling deeper into a state of harm and danger. The world is threatened, the environment is being threatened, social stabilities, peace and harmony are under threat, and also economic growth. And finally, in terms of the values that we have discussed, Islam is founded on powerful values, and many of these values are severely lacking. And just wanted to mention a hadith which I think is so profound in terms of what it means to really understand and practice the value. لا يؤمن أحدكم حتى يحب لأخيه ما يحب لنفسه. I mean, your iman is incomplete until you love for your brother what you love for yourself. Isn't that the highest level of empathy? A Muslim or any human who understands this hadith will not be able to walk past someone who is in pain without stopping and thinking about what do I need to do to help this person in pain. So this, again, the values of empathy and hospitality and many other values, rahmah, ihsan, and birr, which are abundantly discussed in our tradition, should be the basis of our Islamic thought. So the moral system of Islam is not and should not be at the periphery of Islamic thought, but the moral system of Islam must be right at its core and deeply infused and intertwined with our theology and understanding of God and our place in the universe. And I think this is where the curriculum in Islamic education, whether in the higher education institutes, in our masajid, in our Islamic education centers, we really need to bring back that moral discussion, the moral framework right at the center, and that infuses and diffuses around Islamic thought and influences the way that we interpret all the teachings of our faith. And finally, I've come to the last. Well, it's a bit of a trickery. I mean, I said one slide, but actually has four sections. So probably it's 4 slides, yeah? But the idea is to put everything on one page so you can have a quick sense of the summary. And I think we have come to what I feel will make or break our effort towards moderation. This has to do with the most important resources in society, which is religious leaders and religious institutions. And I say this because I think, leaders, and by leaders I mean the religious leaders in particular, we have been presented with opportunities, and some of these are unprecedented opportunities, like the global pandemic. But I'm very worried because there is little evidence that we have truly learned from the crisis to improve and to progress. At the time, if you recall the pandemic, and I say this because I was appointed on March 2020, 1st March 2020, which was just a week before the pandemic hit Singapore. The struggles to deal with such an unprecedented emergency, the uncertainties around theology, ethics, and jurisprudence at the time were very palpable. People were struggling. And in many Muslim circles, we fell back on the notion of darura as an exception to the norm. The pandemic was an emergency, it was an exception. Whilst jurisprudentially it made sense, but it also meant that any lessons we learned evaporated as quickly as the emergency faded away. The whole notion of emergency or darura is a very temporal, very brief period in time. And that was how our mental framework worked. We were only thinking for a brief period of time. So for many of us now, we look back, COVID-19 was just a bad nightmare, but we could have looked at it as leaders, yeah? Not lay people, but as leaders, as an opportunity to renew and refresh so that we could collectively grow and progress. In particular, what we learned at the time about human resilience, solidarity, compassion, about caring and empathizing with other people. And are these not all the values that underpin moderation? And if we had listened very carefully to what Ibn Khaldun said in his Muqaddimah, in the aftermath of the epidemics of his time that were related to the Black Death, he wrote about this as well. And he described the world, وَكَأَنَّهُ خَلْقٌ جَدِيدٌ وَنَشْأَةٌ مُسْتَأْنَفَةٌ وَعَالَمٌ مُحْدَثٌ. The epidemics wiped out the societies in a way that almost a new world was born. A world brought into existence anew. So I urge all of us not to repeat the mistakes of just looking at crises as emergencies that just pass, but we learn from our weaknesses. And here I would just like to recommend a few things which Sheikh Yahya talked about too. One is education and training. The way that we train and educate our religious leaders and scholars so that they're able to engage with confidence, with maturity, the complex modern and contemporary realities. And this is a very important and a critical priority today. And I liked it that Sheikh Yahya talked about interdisciplinary and also multidisciplinary thinking in terms of looking at various perspectives. So the question is, how do we use the social sciences more effectively? In fact, today we can leverage on the artificial intelligence in ethical ways to understand new challenges and bring all this together towards a curriculum that is characterized by moderation, yet acceptable to the tradition. And this is a challenge for educators and curriculum experts, and I hope the conference will open doors and pathways to further thinking in this regard. Now, I just end with my last point on new competencies and skills, just a comment to what Sheikh Yahya said about CRE, continuous religious education or training. In Singapore, we don't call it CRE, we call it CPE, continuous professional education. And there's a reason for that. Because being a religious cleric, an imam, a scholar in society today is a profession. It must be bound by the requirements of integrity, of accountability and responsibility and values. And we look at it as a profession. You have to be subjected to the same rigorous demands and expectations like how lawyers and scientists and medical doctors are subjected to. And only that way, that profession can begin to improve and become better. And there are many ways to do it, and placing it as a profession will help us in that regard. So I end by returning to the first point I made about contextual approach to moderation. All of us may have different experiences, ideas, and proposals how to achieve this. And I think this is the right approach because we know our conditions and context better. So whilst we discuss what is common to all of us, we need to go back and decide how best to achieve this for our respective communities and societies. And we can only do this if we are prepared to deal with the complexities of what lie ahead. And this conference, once again, I congratulate the organizers for organizing what I think is a very important conference. It is a very good start indeed, but we will need greater energy and stamina to swim against extreme, exclusivist, and divisive tides. And I pray that we get the strength and steadfastness to do so. Thank you very much once again. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.